3 years ago, I stood at his funeral and threw a handful of dirt onto his casket. I watched my sister hold my hand while I sobbed so hard I couldn't stand on my own. Marcus Bellamy was gone, and I had to learn how to build a life without him. It took me 2 years to fall in love again. It took me 1 more year to say yes to a wedding dress, a venue, a future I thought I'd never get back. And it took exactly 1 sentence, spoken by a stranger who burst through the chapel doors at the worst possible moment, to destroy everything I thought I understood about the man I buried. My name is Simone Carter, and this is the story of the day I found out my dead fiancé was still alive, and the secret that had been living inside my own family the entire time. Before we move forward, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming amazing videos. My name is Simone Carter, and before I tell you about the day my dead fiancé walked back into my life, I need you to understand who Marcus Bellamy was to me, because you cannot understand the size of the betrayal without first understanding the size of the love it destroyed. I met Marcus when I was 24 years old, working as a pharmaceutical sales representative in a mid-sized city in the Midwest, the kind of job that had me driving between doctors' offices most days, tired and caffeinated, and not particularly interested in meeting anyone new. He was standing behind the counter of a small coffee shop I stopped at most mornings, and for 3 weeks straight, he wrote something different on my cup every single day. A joke, a quote, a ridiculous pun about my order, until I finally asked him for his number, instead of just accepting the coffee. We dated for 2 years before he proposed, and I want to tell you that those 2 years were, without exaggeration, the happiest of my life up to that point. Marcus had this quality that people rarely have, a way of making you feel like you were the most important person in any room, not through grand gestures, but through the accumulation of small, consistent attentions. He remembered things I mentioned once in passing, and brought them up months later. He called his mother every single Sunday without fail. He coached a youth basketball team on Saturday mornings, not because it looked good on paper, but because he genuinely loved those kids and showed up early to unlock the gym himself. He proposed to me on a Tuesday, unremarkable in every way except for what he did with it, taking me to the same coffee shop where we'd met, getting down on one knee in front of the same counter where he'd once slipped me his number scrawled on a napkin. I said yes before he finished asking. We planned a wedding for the following spring, booked a venue, sent out save the dates, built an entire future around a date on a calendar that never came. 6 months before that wedding was supposed to happen, Marcus was driving home from visiting his mother 2 states away, a drive he made regularly, when I got the phone call that would define the next 3 years of my life. There had been an accident on the highway, a multi-car collision in heavy rain, and Marcus's car had been one of the vehicles involved. By the time I arrived at the hospital, hours away, driving faster than I've ever driven in my life with my sister Yolanda beside me because I couldn't trust myself behind the wheel, he was already gone. The details the hospital gave us were sparse, the kind of clinical language hospitals use to explain something too enormous for ordinary words. Severe trauma, not survivable. I remember almost nothing about that night, except the sound I made when the doctor told us, a sound I didn't recognize as coming from my own body. The funeral happened 8 days later, a blur of black clothing and casseroles and well-meaning relatives who didn't know what to say to a 26-year-old woman who just lost the man she was supposed to marry in 5 months. I remember standing at the graveside, my sister's hand gripping mine so tightly it left marks, watching them lower a casket into the ground and trying to reconcile the idea that the man who wrote silly jokes on my coffee cup, who called his mother every Sunday, who coached kids on Saturday mornings, was inside that box, gone forever, 3 years before we should have had any right to bury him. What I didn't understand at the time What I wouldn't understand for 3 more years was that the casket I watched lowered into the ground that day was empty. Marcus Bellamy was not dead. He was, at that very moment, somewhere else entirely, alive, breathing, beginning a new life under circumstances I could not have imagined in my worst nightmares, a life that involved someone I loved almost as much as I'd loved him. But I am getting ahead of myself, because to understand how something like this is even possible, you need to understand what happened in the years after that funeral, the slow, painful process of rebuilding a life around a loss I believed was permanent and irreversible. The first year after Marcus's funeral is mostly a blur to me now, a period I survived more than lived through. I moved back in with my parents for several months because I couldn't bear the silence of the apartment Marcus and I had been planning to share after the wedding. I quit my sales job because I couldn't drive the same highways anymore without my hands shaking on the wheel. I went to grief counseling twice a week, sometimes 3 times when the anniversary of the accident approached, learning slowly how to build a version of myself that could exist in a world without him in it. My sister Yolanda was my anchor through all of it, showing up at my parents' house almost every day, sitting with me through the worst of the breakdowns, never once telling me it was time to move on before I was actually ready to hear those words. By the second year, I had started to reconstruct something resembling a normal life. I took a new job in healthcare administration, less driving, more stability. I started seeing a therapist regularly instead of only in crisis moments. I began, slowly and with enormous guilt, to imagine a future that didn't revolve entirely around grief. It was during this period that I reconnected with a man named Terrence Whitfield, someone I'd known peripherally through mutual friends for years, who had recently gone through his own painful divorce and understood, in a way that felt less like performance and more like genuine recognition, what it meant to rebuild a life you never expected to need rebuilding. Terrence and I moved slowly, cautiously, both of us aware of the wreckage we were each carrying. He never rushed me, never made me feel guilty for the moments grief still ambushed me, even years later. Never once asked me to stop talking about Marcus when his memory surfaced unexpectedly. By the time we'd been together for almost 2 years, I found myself, somewhat to my own surprise, genuinely happy again, not in a way that erased what I'd lost, but in a way that coexisted alongside it, the way I've since learned real healing often does. When Terrence proposed, on a quiet weekend trip to the coast, I said yes with a certainty that felt different from the certainty I'd felt with Marcus, not lesser, just different, tempered by the specific wisdom that comes from having survived the worst thing you thought could happen to you. We planned our wedding for 18 months out, giving ourselves plenty of time, giving me plenty of time, to make sure this decision came from genuine readiness rather than simply loneliness or fear of being alone. My family was thrilled, relieved in a way they tried not to show too obviously, having watched me disappear into grief for so long that my happiness now felt like something precious and fragile they didn't want to disturb. Yolanda was my maid of honor, exactly as she'd been planning to be at my first wedding that never happened. And I remember catching her crying happy tears during a dress fitting a few months before the ceremony, telling me she was so relieved to see me finally get the life I deserved. I had no idea, standing in that dress fitting room, watching my sister cry tears I believed were entirely about joy, that some of what she was carrying that day was something far more complicated than relief. I had no idea that the wedding I was planning, the future I was building with Terrence, was moving toward a collision with a truth so enormous that when it finally arrived, it would not just end my second engagement, but would force me to question everything I thought I understood about my own family, my own sister, and the 3 years I'd spent grieving a man who, all along, had never actually left this earth at all. The wedding day arrived on a bright Saturday in early October, the kind of crisp autumn afternoon that photographers dream about. golden light slanting through the tall windows of the chapel Terence and I had chosen almost a year earlier. I remember standing in the small preparation room off to the side of the sanctuary, my mother fussing with the buttons on the back of my dress, Yolanda arranging my veil with hands that I now understand, in hindsight, were shaking more than the occasion alone should have caused. I was nervous the way any bride is nervous, but underneath the nerves was a genuine, hard-won happiness, the feeling of having survived something unimaginable and come out the other side, still capable of joy. I want to walk you through the moments right before everything fell apart, because I've replayed them so many times since that they've become almost unbearably vivid in my memory. I remember the string quartet beginning the processional. I remember my father's arm steady beneath my hand as we stood at the back of the chapel, waiting for the doors to open. I remember catching a glimpse of Terence at the altar, through the crack in the doorway, his face already emotional, already fighting back tears at the mere sight of the doors about to open. I remember thinking, in that exact moment, that I had never felt more certain of anything in my life. The doors opened, and my father and I began walking down the aisle, and for a few precious seconds, everything was exactly as it should have been, exactly as I'd imagined it during 18 months of planning. And then, from the back of the chapel, I heard the heavy wooden doors crash open a second time, hard enough that the sound echoed off the vaulted ceiling, hard enough that every single guest turned in their seats at once. I turned too, still holding my father's arm, still halfway down the aisle in my wedding dress, and I saw a man standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright afternoon light behind him, chest heaving like he'd been running. For a moment, my mind simply could not process what I was looking at. The shape of him, the height, the way he stood, all of it registered as achingly, impossibly familiar before my conscious mind caught up to what my body already seemed to understand. He stepped further into the chapel, out of the silhouette of the doorway, and into the light, and I felt my father's arm go rigid beneath my hand, felt the entire room seem to hold its breath at once, because standing in the doorway of my wedding, 3 years after I had watched his casket lowered into the ground, was Marcus Bellamy. I don't remember dropping my bouquet, though I'm told I did. I don't remember the sound I made, though several guests later described it to me as something between a scream and a sob, a sound of a person's entire understanding of reality cracking open in real time. What I remember is the chapel spinning slightly, my father's arm, the only thing keeping me upright, and Marcus, my dead fiancé, standing in the aisle of my second wedding, alive, breathing, looking at me with an expression I can only describe as anguished, like a man watching a decision he couldn't take back play out in real time in front of him. Before Marcus could say anything, before I could even find the capacity to form a coherent thought, another figure moved from near the front of the chapel, someone who had been sitting in the family section this entire time, someone whose face I knew better than almost anyone else's on this earth. Yolanda, my sister, my maid of honor, the woman who had held my hand at Marcus's funeral 3 years earlier, ran down the aisle toward him, not toward me, and grabbed his arm with a familiarity that made no sense in the moment, except that some deep, instinctive part of me already understood, even before a single word was spoken, exactly what that familiarity meant. She was crying, begging him to leave, telling him this wasn't the way, that he'd promised, that he couldn't do this here, in front of everyone, in front of me, and in that single unraveling moment, standing frozen halfway down the aisle in my wedding dress, I understood 2 devastating truths simultaneously. The man I had grieved for 3 years, the man whose funeral I had planned, whose casket I had watched lowered into the ground, was alive, and my own sister, the person who had comforted me through the darkest year of my life, had known it, possibly for all 3 of those years, and had said absolutely nothing. The chapel dissolved into chaos after that. Terence came down from the altar, understandably confused and increasingly alarmed, trying to understand what was happening, while guests whispered, and some stood in their seats for a better view of the unfolding disaster. My mother was crying. My father was demanding, in a voice I'd rarely heard him use, that someone explain immediately what was going on. And in the middle of all of it, Marcus stood there, having apparently changed his mind about whatever confrontation he'd planned once he saw the actual scale of the life he'd be interrupting, looking at me with an expression that mixed guilt and longing and something that looked infuriatingly like he still believed he had some right to disrupt this moment. I don't remember exactly what I said to him in those first few minutes, though people who were there have told me since that I asked him, over and over, how, simply how, as if the mechanics of his survival were the only question that mattered in that instant, when really I think some part of me was trying to buy time before I had to confront the much larger and more devastating question of why. Why he had let me believe he was dead. Why he had let me grieve him for 3 years, plan an entire second life without him, fall in love again, build toward a wedding day he apparently felt entitled to interrupt. And beneath all of that, the question that hurt the most to even silently form in my mind: why my own sister, who I trusted more than almost anyone alive, had carried this secret alongside him the entire time. Terrence, to his enormous credit, understood almost immediately that whatever was happening required more urgent handling than continuing with a wedding ceremony, and he asked the officiant to clear the chapel, asked our families to step outside, asked, with a steadiness I will be forever grateful for given the circumstances, for someone to explain to him exactly what was going on before he made any decisions about what happened next. I remember him taking my hand, not accusatory, not angry at me, just holding on, grounding me the way he'd grounded me so many times over the 2 years we'd been together, while around us, the wreckage of my wedding day continued to unfold in real time. We ended up in a small side room off the chapel, the same room where I'd gotten dressed hours earlier, filled now with my parents, Terrence, Yolanda, and Marcus, all of us crowded into a space too small to contain the enormity of what needed to be said. I sat down because I genuinely wasn't sure my legs would hold me any longer, and I looked at my sister, tears streaming down both our faces, and I asked her the only question I had the strength to ask in that moment. I asked her how long she had known that Marcus was alive. Her answer, when it finally came, broken and halting between sobs, was the second devastating blow of that afternoon, because it wasn't the answer of someone who had recently discovered a shocking secret and struggled with when to tell me. It was the answer of someone who had been carrying this knowledge and this betrayal for almost the entire 3 years I had spent believing I'd lost the love of my life. Yolanda's confession came out in fragments at first, her voice breaking so badly that my mother had to ask her to slow down, to breathe, to start from the beginning. What she eventually told us, sitting in that cramped side room with her wedding guest makeup streaked down her face, unraveled almost everything I thought I understood about the worst year of my life. She told us that Marcus had, in fact, been in a serious car accident 3 years earlier, exactly as we'd been told, but that he had survived it, badly injured but alive, and that in the chaotic aftermath of the multi-car collision, hospital records had somehow become confused with those of another accident victim, a man of similar age and build who had died at the scene. She told us that Marcus had woken up in the hospital days later, disoriented from a head injury, and that in the confusion of that recovery, in ways she struggled to fully explain even now, a series of decisions had been made, decisions she herself had become tangled up in, almost from the very beginning. I want to be careful here, because even now, years removed from that day, I still don't have perfect clarity on every detail of how the confusion started, or who first realized the mistake could be exploited rather than corrected. What I do know, because Marcus himself eventually explained it to me in a separate, agonizing conversation weeks later, is that in the disoriented days following his accident, grappling with injuries and a level of guilt and fear he said he still struggled to fully articulate, he made a choice that he now understood, with the clarity of hindsight, as the most cowardly decision of his life. Rather than correct the hospital's error immediately, rather than call me the moment he regained consciousness, he let the mistaken identification stand. He told the hospital staff, in his confusion and fear, a story that supported the confusion rather than corrected it, and by the time enough days had passed, that reversing course would have required an enormous, humiliating unraveling of the lie, he told himself it was too late to fix, without destroying everything, without facing the people who loved him, without explaining a decision that made less and less sense to even himself the longer he let it continue. I sat in that room, my wedding dress bunched around me, listening to my sister explain how Marcus had reached out to her 3 weeks after the funeral, terrified and guilt-ridden, needing someone to talk to, someone who could help him understand what he'd done and whether there was any way to undo it. She told us that instead of immediately telling me, instead of immediately forcing the confrontation that should have happened, she had let herself become his confidant, his secret keeper, meeting with him periodically over the following months as he tried to work through what he'd done, as the lie calcified further with each passing week that the truth remained buried. I asked her, my voice barely functioning, why she hadn't told me the moment he first reached out to her, why she had chosen to sit beside me at his funeral, to hold my hand while I sobbed, to spend an entire year helping me grieve a man she knew, within weeks of his supposed death, was very much alive. She told me, through fresh tears, that she had been paralyzed by an impossible calculation, terrified that telling me the truth would destroy me even more completely than the grief already had, terrified of what it would mean for our family if this ever became public, terrified, she admitted, when of her own complicity growing worse the longer she waited, until eventually the length of her silence became its own trap, a secret so large and so old that she genuinely didn't know how to unearth it without detonating everything around her. What she told me next was the detail that changed the entire shape of my understanding of those 3 years. She admitted that somewhere in the months of secret meetings and phone calls with Marcus, something had shifted between them, something neither of them had intended or expected, born out of shared guilt and shared secrecy and the strange intimacy that comes from being the only two people who understand the true shape of a devastating lie. She told me, unable to look at me while she said it, that she and Marcus had become involved, romantically, sometime during that first year, and that the relationship had continued, in secret, for the better part of 2 years, even as I grieved him, even as I slowly rebuilt my life, even as I fell in love with Terrence and planned an entire second wedding. I don't have adequate words for what I felt in that moment, hearing that my sister, my maid of honor, the woman who had comforted me through the darkest period of my life, had spent much of that same period building a secret relationship with the very man I believed I'd buried. I understand now, with the distance of time, that this detail is the part of the story that most people find hardest to comprehend, harder even than the faked death itself. But in that room, in my wedding dress, surrounded by my devastated family, I simply felt something inside me go completely silent, a shock so total it moved past anger into a kind of blank, disbelieving stillness. Marcus, for his part, sat largely silent through most of Yolanda's confession, occasionally adding details, occasionally taking responsibility in ways that felt, even in that moment, insufficient against the scale of what he'd done. He told me he had come to the wedding that day not to reclaim me, not to disrupt my life out of some belief he still deserved a place in it, but because he'd learned, only days earlier, that I was getting married again, and something in him, some final unresolved piece of guilt and love and cowardice all tangled together, had made the decision to show up, uninvited and unannounced, driven by an impulse he himself seemed to struggle to fully justify even as he described it. He told me he understood, watching my face while he spoke, that whatever he'd hoped to accomplish by coming, closure, confession, some kind of absolution, none of it justified the devastation he'd just caused by choosing my wedding day as the moment to finally surface. Terrence, throughout all of this, sat beside me with a stillness that I understood, even in my own shattered state, was costing him enormous effort to maintain. When Yolanda and Marcus finished their overlapping, agonized explanations, he asked, quietly, if he could speak with me alone. We stepped outside the small room into a hallway, away from my family, away from the wreckage still unfolding behind that closed door, and he asked me, gently, what I needed from him in that moment, whether I needed space, whether I needed him to stay, whether I even knew yet what I wanted at all. I told him honestly that I didn't know anything in that moment except that the wedding could not continue, that I needed time, real time, to understand what had actually happened to the last 3 years of my life before I could think clearly about anything else, including us. He told me he understood, that he wasn't going anywhere, but that he also wasn't going to pretend this was a simple problem we could push through for the sake of finishing a ceremony. He told me, and I will always remember the steadiness in his voice given everything happening around us, that he loved me enough to give me whatever time I needed to make sense of this, even if making sense of it meant questioning everything, including him, including us, including whether I was even capable of trusting anyone again after discovering that the two people I trusted most, my sister and the man I'd once planned to marry, had built an entire secret world around a lie that consumed 3 years of my life. I left my own wedding that day still in my dress, riding home with my parents in a silence so complete it felt like its own kind of scream, trying to comprehend that the man I had buried was alive, that my sister had known almost from the beginning, that the two of them had built something together in the space carved out by my grief, and that I now had to figure out, with no roadmap and no precedent for a betrayal this specific, whether there was any version of my family, my sister, or my own heart that could survive what had just been revealed in front of everyone I loved. The weeks that followed my wedding day exist in my memory as a strange, suspended fog, the kind of period where time moves both too fast and too slow simultaneously. I moved back into my parents' house for the second time in my adult life, the first having been in the immediate aftermath of Marcus's supposed death, and the symmetry of that wasn't lost on me, the way grief and betrayal had somehow led me back to the same childhood bedroom twice in 1 decade, each time believing my life had fundamentally ended, each time discovering it hadn't, not entirely, though the shape of what remained looked nothing like what came before. I didn't speak to Yolanda for almost 6 weeks after that day. She tried, repeatedly, calling and texting and eventually showing up at our parents' house uninvited, standing on the porch begging to be let in, to be given a chance to explain further, to apologize in whatever way I might eventually be able to hear. I refused all of it initially, not out of cruelty, but because I genuinely did not trust myself to be in the same room as her, without saying something I couldn't take back, and more than that, I didn't yet understand my own feelings well enough to have any productive conversation with her at all. My parents, caught in an impossible position between 2 daughters, tried to remain neutral in a way that I understood intellectually, but resented emotionally, wanting them to be as furious on my behalf as I felt they should be, while also recognizing that Yolanda was still their child too, still deserving of some measure of grace, even amid the wreckage she'd helped create. Marcus, for his part, largely disappeared from my life again after that day, though this time by mutual understanding rather than deception. He sent one letter, several weeks later, a long handwritten apology that attempted to explain, in more detail than he'd managed in that chaotic side room, the psychological unraveling that had led him to make the initial decision not to correct the hospital's mistaken identification, and the subsequent years of compounding cowardice that had kept him from undoing it. I read that letter perhaps a dozen times over the following months, searching it for some explanation that would make the entire ordeal comprehensible in a way that didn't leave me feeling like the last 3 years of my life had been built on a foundation that never actually existed. I never fully found that comprehension, though I did eventually come to believe, based on everything I learned in the aftermath, that Marcus's initial choice had been born more from panic and psychological crisis than calculated cruelty, even as the years of continued silence that followed became something closer to the latter with each passing month he allowed it to continue. The relationship between Marcus and Yolanda, I learned through the slow, painful process of piecing together the full timeline, had ended almost 8 months before my wedding day, not because either of them had come to their senses about the damage they were causing, but because of an argument between them about whether the secret could be maintained indefinitely. An argument Yolanda later told me had left her in a state of guilt, so consuming she'd nearly told me the truth on several separate occasions in the months that followed, only to lose her nerve each time she got close, terrified of how thoroughly the revelation would destroy not just my trust in her, but potentially my parents' understanding of our entire family history. The heaviest disagreement between Yolanda and me, when we finally did speak again almost 2 months after the wedding, centered not on the affair itself, painful as that was, but on the specific choice she'd made to sit beside me at Marcus's funeral, to comfort me through that first devastating year, knowing the entire time that the grief I was drowning in was built on a lie she was actively helping to maintain. I told her, during that first raw conversation, that I could almost, find a path toward understanding the affair as a symptom of 2 people caught in an impossible secret together, human weakness compounding on itself in ways that, while devastating, at least made some emotional sense. What I could not understand, what felt unforgivable in a way the affair itself somehow didn't quite reach, was the specific cruelty of comforting me through invented grief while sitting on the knowledge that could have ended it at any moment. Yolanda didn't try to defend that choice the way she'd initially tried to defend her silence in general terms. She told me, crying in a way that felt different from the performative tears of the wedding day, more exhausted, more genuinely broken, that she had asked herself the same question every single day for 3 years, and that the honest answer she'd finally arrived at was almost too shameful to say out loud. She told me that once she was tangled up with Marcus, once the secret became something she was actively protecting for her own reasons rather than simply his, sitting beside me at that funeral had become an act of self-preservation disguised as sisterly comfort, that some part of her, the part she was least proud of, had understood that maintaining the fiction of his death, maintaining my grief, was the only way to keep her own secret safe, and that recognizing this about herself, admitting it out loud to me in that conversation, was the hardest thing she'd ever had to do. I want to be honest about something. I did not forgive Yolanda quickly, and I'm not sure, even now, that what exists between us today qualifies as full forgiveness in the way people typically use that word. What we built instead, over the following year, through more difficult conversations than I can count, through family therapy sessions that our parents insisted on and eventually joined themselves, was something more complicated than forgiveness, a kind of ongoing, effortful reconciliation that required both of us to accept a permanently changed relationship rather than a fully repaired one. I learned to trust her again in small, specific ways, while accepting that the total, unguarded trust I'd had for her before that wedding day was gone permanently, not as punishment, but as the natural consequence of what she'd done, a consequence I came to understand she also had to accept as permanent, rather than something she could eventually earn back to its original state. Terrence and I did not get married that year, or the year after, though we also did not immediately separate the way some people might have expected, given the catastrophic circumstances surrounding our almost wedding. We took an extended pause instead, agreeing that I needed real time to process not just what had happened, but what it revealed about my own capacity to trust, about how thoroughly a foundation you believe is solid can turn out to be built on secrets you never suspected. Terrence was patient during that period in a way that, looking back, I understand now was its own quiet test of the kind of partner he actually was, someone willing to hold space for my healing without making that healing about his own timeline or his own needs. We eventually did marry, almost 2 years after that devastating wedding day, in a small ceremony with only immediate family present, no elaborate chapel, no string quartet, nothing that echoed the disaster of what came before. Yolanda was there, not as my maid of honor this time, a role I gave instead to a close friend who had nothing to do with the wreckage of that earlier day, but present, invited, a sign of the complicated, ongoing reconciliation we'd built in the 2 years between. Marcus was not there, and has not been part of my life since that letter, though I heard, secondhand through mutual acquaintances, that he eventually moved to another state, started over in whatever way a person starts over after choices like the ones he made, though I have no way of knowing whether he ever fully reckoned with the damage of those 3 years, the way the rest of us were forced to. I think, now, about that moment standing halfway down the aisle in my wedding dress, watching those chapel doors crash open, more often than I'd like to admit. I used to believe the worst moment of my life was the night I got the phone call about Marcus's accident, the moment I thought I'd lost him forever. I understand now that the actual devastation wasn't losing him. It was discovering, 3 years later, that the loss itself had never been real, that an entire foundation of grief I'd built my healing on top of had been constructed from a lie 2 people I loved had chosen to maintain, for their own complicated and human reasons, at the cost of nearly 3 years of my life. What I've learned in the years since, slowly rebuilding trust with my sister, building a genuine marriage with a man who stayed through the wreckage of a day that should have ended us, is that some betrayals don't have clean resolutions. They simply become part of the permanent architecture of who you are, reshaping what trust means to you, teaching you, in the hardest way possible, that even the people closest to you are capable of choices you never could have imagined, and that surviving that knowledge, rather than being destroyed by it, is its own kind of victory, imperfect and hard-won as it is.